Okay, welcome to episode 3 of the Leap of Faith podcast. Today's topic is biblical translations and biblical languages and translations. Sorry about that. But yes, biblical languages and translations. And we're going to be talking about the Bible, the languages it was written in, the languages it was translated into, and all the different various versions and the evolution of how writing was started with the biblical text. And talking about that biblical or that history of the technology of writing, it's interesting that originally the Bible, when it was first written down, was probably written on parchment and not what we know as paper today, due to the time frame that and the evolution of writing and the technology of that people were using for writing began starting with around 1400 BC when the children of Israel came out of Egypt and when Moses first started to write down the Pentateuch or the Torah, 5 books of Moses, or the Pentateuch too, which is also another a Greek word meaning the 5 books, and the Torah being the Hebrew name for the 5 books of Moses. And so anyway, um, to go back to when writing, even before the Bible was written, like as we know it today, you had in that area of the Middle East or the ancient Near East. In Egypt, they had a form of writing. The hieroglyphs. They carved things in stone, of course. But when they wanted to write things down, like as like as in paper or something like that, what they used was a thing called papyrus. And what papyrus was it was a way of writing down. It was a type of parchment, but it wasn't parchment because parchment was made from animal skins. But before people started using animal skins to use as a writing material, papyrus was used. And what papyrus was the technology behind that was the papyrus. It's like a plant that grows in the swamps of Egypt. It did, and it does to this day. And what they would do is they would cut it into strips. It would be like just like a stick, but but it was like a triangular stalk. And they would basically cut it into strips and then pound it out flat to get all the moisture out. And then they would weave it like over like they would originally have like they would go horizontal, like one strip of strips of papyrus running horizontally, and then they would go vertically. So it was like an overlay, and they would write on, and that's how the ancient Egyptians would write a lot of their writings, their books, their spells, the hieroglyphs or whatever, and that was called papyrus, and that's where we get the word paper from paper or papyrus in the modern uh, tongue. And anyway, the history of this is how how the word Bible came about. It's an interesting story because in the ancient world, Egypt was because the papyrus plant or the stalk or the weed or whatever that grew in the swamps was specifically native to Egypt. Egypt had the monopoly on the writing material for the ancient world, and we're talking like maybe I guess between 2000 BC and 1000 BC, so about for 1,000 years or so, or at least 500 or so, I would say that Egypt had that monopoly. And what they would do was they had a ancient Egyptians had a deal with the Phoenicians, and of course the Phoenicians lived in the country of modern day Lebanon, and that was a port city. It was a port. There was a coast, the Phoenician coast, and they were known for their ships, and they went all over the Mediterranean and also elsewhere. And so a lot of the shipping was done by the Phoenicians. So what would happen was the Egyptians had to deal with the Phoenicians that they would transport their papyrus to the Phoenicians, and then from Phoenicia they would transport it to the rest of the Mediterranean. And so they were known like as the dealers of this papyrus. And when they did business with the Greeks bought a lot of papyrus, and the port city that the Greeks would get the papyrus from in Phoenicia was called Byblos. And that town, that city Byblos, is still there to this day, and it's still called Byblos. It's one of the most ancient cities, most ancient continuous living cities in the world. Like it's been people have lived in that settlement for thousands of years, literally. it hasn't been raised or demolished or like they find some towns in the Middle East. It's like they'll be just look like a field, and they do archaeology work, and they found there was once a city there. Well, was like it was destroyed, it was burned or whatever, and then they just erased it from history. But that's not the case with Byblos. Byblos has been there for a long time, and I think it's one of the most oldest continuously living cities in the world. But the interesting thing about the word Byblos is that because it was known by the Greeks for the papyrus, for the writing material, they started to call the papyrus not papyrus but biblion, and then that's where you get the word Bible, and that's where we get the word book. So that's kind of like the evolution of how even before the Bible itself was written uh, on paper or parchment or papyrus, that's where you first got the whole history of how the Bible was able to be written. Because to be able to write, having the revelation is one thing, but okay, how am I going to write this down? What text am I going to use? What kind of writing material am I going to use? What kind of ink am I going to use? And the thing about the ink was it was usually made from like charcoal, like carbon ground up with like maybe some vegetable glues, or possibly even like possibly, I don't know for sure, but maybe the animal fat. I'm not too sure. But basically, it was basically you just use the carbon or the charcoal, and you added a little bit of some type of glue to make the black. That would make the ink, so it would stick on the paper, the papyrus or the parchment. And after papyrus was used for a long time, it transferred to parchment. And what parchment was basically the skin of a calf. Sometimes they use lambskin later on, but originally it was used by the skin of a calf, a baby calf. And it took a long time to prepare the parchment, because you had to skin the calf. You had to soak it and put it in lye to get some of the hair and the fat to come off, and then you had to scrape it, and then you had to stretch it and put it out in the sun, and then continuously water it. So it's a very costly, very time-consuming way. For example, when Jerome, hopefully we'll talk about soon in this talk about when Saint Jerome went to translate the Bible from Hebrew into Latin. He used I think it was at least 300 skins of 300 calves to write his Bible, or his translation of the Bible from Hebrew into Latin. That was parchment. So we've come a long way from that. I mean, now we can do so many things digitally. And the thing about the parchment with the scribes and everything that came later on, the Christian scribes, if they would make a mistake, my goodness, it's like how are you gonna the time it took to correct that. And that's another thing when you'll find out with the scribes, with I talked about the Christian scribes, with the Jewish scribes, when they would go about writing the Torah, and make copies of it, how they had to do it all by hand. If they made, I think when they would look it over after it was done, and if they found three mistakes or more than three mistakes, they would throw out the whole thing because they had corrupted the word of God. So, I mean, my goodness, it's like it takes me a long time to read all five books of Moses. Just think if you had to, how much time it would take to write to copy the five books of Moses. And if you made too many mistakes, and then you'd have to start all over again. That's pretty brutal. So anyway, that's just about. I just wanted to cover that, the history of how we got writing material. It started from papyrus, then parchment, and then it was later on that the paper was invented, and then of course the printing press, and the rest is history. And that was more so in the after the Protestant Reformation, and you had the Gutenberg Bible that was people were able to mass produce Bibles, and for the first time people could have a Bible in their home that wasn't so expensive. Because I mean, think about it, if you make one translation, to write one, to copy a Bible, and I know how thick the Bible, how many pages it is, how many books, both the Old and New Testament. You're looking at a lot of money, just because it was not just the materials to produce, but also the labor that was involved in putting a Bible together, to copying a Bible. So it's only the very wealthy that could actually have a Bible in their possession. And it wasn't until the era of the printing press when that made it more accessible to the common people. And now you can get a Bible for free. You know, I mean, it's that convenient. But at one time that wasn't the case. But so we've come a long way. In the transliteration and the translation, the different versions, and the technology about how the Bible or how books in general are produced. And that's another thing too. When we look again, talking about the history of writing. At one time, everything was on scrolls. Even the papyrus was on scrolls. The parchment was a scroll. But it wasn't until the early Christian era, where the thing what they called a codex was invented. And the codex is the early form of what we know today as books. And basically, you would have, instead of a scroll that was just one long, uh, paper that you would roll up. They invented the codex to where you could turn the pages, and it would be basically sewn together instead of rolled up into a scroll. So really, Christianity, in a lot of ways, can be given uh, the respect that it was through the copying of the Gospels and the various other epistles of the New Testament is where the history is where the book form of writing was first introduced for the first time, because before that it was all scrolls. And if you look in some of the early Christian artwork, you'll see like the saints holding scrolls, but then you'll also see other saints, other icons where they're holding a book. So that shows us that at the early times they were using scrolls and it evolved into books and what we have today. So that's just an interesting, you know, backstory or behind the scenes of how we got the Bible and on how it came to us today in the book form that we have. And so, beginning with the first book of the Bible, Genesis. Then you had Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the five books of Moses. Those were believed to be the first scriptures that the Jews had, or the children of Israel had, and it was originally written in Hebrew. But there's also like some discrepancies there as well, like the block Hebrew, like this type of Hebrew script that we get today, also known as the block Hebrew or square Hebrew. Uh, that wasn't. That's not the most ancient form of Hebrew. That's more of a modern, maybe the past 500, maybe to 1,000 years or something. It hasn't always been. So basically, when the Torah was originally written, they weren't using the block Hebrew script that we know today. And that's another problem when it comes to the translations, and what gets lost in translation is that we have to figure out somehow is that how did this Bible come to us? And what is the original language? And all these different translations, the meaning somehow gets lost somehow. That's why, like when growing up reading the King James Bible and then going a little bit further, I had to realize that some of these words, even the King James, which I think is one of the best English translations, I know it's a little bit difficult for some people to read that aren't familiar with it because of the language that's used, the Old English. That can be a stumbling block for some people because we don't talk like that anymore. But I think it's good because Old English is an older form of English, and I think that's appropriate because you're translating an older form of Hebrew and Greek. Even ancient Greek, even the Greek that was written, even the modern Greek is different from the ancient Greek. So basically, even Greek speakers, even Greeks, if they read the original Greek that the Gospel, the New Testament was written in, it's a little bit different too. And then of course we have the Septuagint, that was the Old Testament translation from the Hebrew into Greek. And hopefully we'll talk about that a little bit later. But going back to the Moses, when the writing of the Old Testament originally, there's a belief that there was a language. It was Hebrew, but they call it Proto-Canaanite. And the reason why it's called Proto-Canaanite or sometimes Proto-Semitic is because when doing archaeological work, back in the late 1800s, they found that, I think it was Flinders Petrie was looking through the cave because it was known that the ancient Egyptians had these turquoise they mined turquoise out of the caves, out of the rocks in the Sinai Peninsula. And it's believed that during when the children of Israel were enslaved in Egypt, that they were there mining that turquoise. And it's amazing the discovery that was found was that when they went into these caves, or these what was left of this the mines of the turquoise, they found Hebrew writing, an ancient form of Hebrew writing in those caves. So that was an evidence. There's two evidence: evidence that there was an Israelite presence in Egypt, possibly even slavery. They were doing some type of manual work, and also the history, the writing was there as well. But it wasn't the same type of Hebrew that we know today. So even if Moses wrote the Torah with that Proto-Canaanite script, eventually over the time when as the language of Hebrew developed, then they would also have had to have developed the writing of the Bible. You know, so that's another problem, is that how do we know what the original Hebrew was? Now, the oldest form of the Old Testament, really, that we do know of, is actually not written in Hebrew, but it's written in Greek, and that's the Septuagint, the Greek Septuagint. And that was written, or I should say translated, around between 300 and about the mid third century BC. And what that was that after Alexander the Great died and his generals, his kingdom was divided among his four generals. The Ptolemies ruled in Egypt, and they had the Library of Alexandria there. And the story goes that I think it was Ptolemy the Soter wanted a copy of all the books in the world in that famous Library of Alexandria, and he wanted them specifically written in Greek because that was the language that was used at that time. You know, during after the conquest of Alexander the Great, he was Macedonian Greek. They're all his whole that whole there were Greek speakers, and that's how the Hellenistic culture, the Hellenistic language, even got spread throughout all the world. And so that's why you see Greek a lot in the ancient world, and that was through Alexander. So his successor, Ptolemy, wanted to have these, not just to have all the books, but he wanted them to be written in Greek. And since there was a lot of Jews living in Alexandria, which were attracted there because it was lucrative, there was higher education available there. It was very cultured, and that was very attractive to a lot of Jewish people that were living in that area, not just in Judea, but in the other parts of the Mediterranean. And so it became a hub of learning, academics, culture, and of course, because of the library, that was like an institute of higher learning. And so because of that, the story goes, and I say story because it's debatable about how the authenticity of this story, but the story goes is that Ptolemy summoned 72 Jewish scholars that were proficient in Hebrew and Greek, and he commissioned them to translate the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, the books that they had, from the original Hebrew into Greek. And he put them all away into their own little study halls, cells, little rooms that they would translate by themselves. And when they got, and when after the certain amount of time after everything was written, all the different versions of the Bible that the translations were looked up were collected, and they all matched. So then that was like the stamp of approval that this is a legitimate translation, and that's how we get the word Septuagint, which is a Greek word, means of the 70, and that's so that's how we get the Greek Septuagint. And so that was and that Greek Septuagint that was written in the mid third century BC, we still have a copy. We still have that original copy with us. It's still available. And actually, I have a copy of it too. It's the Greek on one side and English on the other. And so basically, it's an English translation from the Greek, and that's a pretty valuable thing to have in any Bible scholar's library. To double check. You have the King James, and you can double check the Greek, and it's very good because it gives us a better understanding. What you'll learn is by reading various translations, even though there may be some discrepancies, but by basically what's the word I'm looking for? By basically discerning between the different translations and texts, you get a better understanding of what that idea, that meaning comes through. And just real quick to talk about that, yeah, the 72, it was originally 72 people, but when they say Septuagint of the 70, they just round it down. It's just like if it was 78, they would have called it the octogenarian or something like that. It was just a rounding down since it was closer to, it would be, instead of saying the 72, they just say of the 70, just to make it kosher. But anyway, so yeah, so actually the most, so that's just it. So we have the oldest form of the Old Testament in its in a language is actually not in Hebrew but in Greek, the Septuagint, the ancient Greek language. And then what's also interesting, to just some food for thought, in the time of Christ, a couple centuries later, it's like, okay, what were the people in the synagogue? What were people if what were people reading? Were they reading Hebrew or were they reading Greek? Like when Christ went up to the synagogue and wrote and read the prophecy of Isaiah, what was he reading from? Was he reading the Hebrew scriptures, or was it Greek? Or was it Aramaic? We really don't know. That's kind of a mystery, because during the time of Christ, the languages, the colloquial language of that time was Aramaic, but they were also speaking Hebrew. We know they were speaking Hebrew in the synagogue and the temple, of course, and then there was also Greek speaking. Greeks, the Greek language was being used because at that time it was ruled by the Roman Empire, and the Romans spoke Greek, and they also spoke Latin. Because if you remember, when Christ was crucified, they put the sign above him. Here is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, but it was written in three languages: Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. So there's a fourth language. So not only was in Jesus' day, not just his day, but in his location, the geography, where in Judea, we know they were speaking Greek, they were speaking Hebrew, they were speaking Aramaic, and they were also speaking Latin. So you had so it wasn't just there's a lot of different uh things going on. And talking about those three main languages, Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, if you look in the Dead Sea Scroll Library, those are the oldest Bibles that we have. See, there I should backtrack a little bit. The oldest Bible that we knew for a while was the Septuagint, written in Greek. But then when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, those are the oldest surviving manuscripts that we have of Hebrew, of the ancient Hebrew, and that dates to about 200 BC, roughly. They think the Dead Sea Scrolls date from about 200 BC to about 100 AD. So we have 200 years before the coming of Christ and about 100 years after Christ. So yeah, so really the Dead Sea Scrolls gave us a lot of insight into the Hebrew script that was being written and read at that time, and it's a little bit different than the block Hebrew that we know today. But you can still read it. It's still, Hebrew rabbis, Hebrew scholar. I mean, yeah, Hebrew scholars, Bible scholars, uh, can still read the Hebrew of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And yes, 10 point, to answer your question about, yes, Jesus did say not one jot or one tittle will pass away. That's in the King James language, so that makes you think that he must have been referring to Hebrew. So that's a good point. So that just shows you that the Hebrew scrolls in the synagogues and in the temples specifically, they must have been using Hebrew for their writings. But we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls there was also Greek manuscripts and a lot of Aramaic as well. There was more Hebrew. The majority of the scrolls were written in Hebrew and Aramaic, but some of the scrolls were also, they found, written in Greek, but not the majority. That's a good point. That's a good thing to go by. That even though that there was Greek being spoken and written down, the dominant languages, liturgical languages, the for the religion goes, was still probably being used in Hebrew and to a lesser point Aramaic. But yeah, but those three languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, were being used, written, and read uh, in the time of Christ, or any before the time of Christ and a little bit after. So that's really interesting how that all came to be. So yeah, so when it comes to the Hebrew that we have today, It is a little bit different than, of course, what was originally written. And like, if it was started off as Proto-Canaanite, and then uh, as time went on, it was altered a little bit, or it evolved. Then it's kind of makes you wonder: was something lost in translation? Was something of that original, dialect lost? And that's just, we really don't know, or at least I don't know. There might be some scholar classicists out there that are proficient in Greek, Hebrew, and some ancient languages. They might be better off answering that question. But from so far, for the research that I've done, it's inconclusive. You know, so really the best translation that we have of the Old Testament is probably the Septuagint, and that's written in Greek. And then the Masoretic text is actually the Hebrew, the more modern form of the Hebrew Old Testament, or what you call the Hebrew Bible. And that's what we'll talk about, the books for the Christians that have. They would call those the Old Testament, and then the books that the Jews would have, that would be called the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh. And I'll talk about that here in a second, about what's the difference. I even thought that the Old Testament is the same as the Hebrew Bible, but it's a little bit different because the Old Testament, for one thing, the original Old Testament that the Christians used included more books than what the Jews accepted, what the rabbis accepted, and mainly because those books that the Christians accepted, but the rabbis didn't, or the Jews didn't, were called the Apocrypha, and which is a word from Greek origin meaning hidden. And those books were originally written in Greek and not Hebrew. And so that was the reason why the Jews kind of rejected those, because they didn't think that they were authentic Jewish writings, mainly because even though they were talking about Jewish history and whatever, because it was written in a foreign language, originally written in a foreign language, that couldn't be accepted in strict Judaism for the Jewish culture, the religion, and all that kind of stuff. And even the Protestants did take those books out of the Bible that are called the Apocrypha. But it's interesting, at the beginning they didn't. Even up until, even when Martin Luther, the father of the Protestant Reformation, he originally, when he translated the Bible into German, and when he did this, he originally he wrote the Apocrypha. The books that the Jews don't accept, and the books that some Protestants don't accept now, but at one time they did, because even Martin Luther accepted them. He just called them he called it an intertestamental section of the Bible. And basically, those, you had the Bible, the Old Testament, and then you had the books of the Apocrypha, which were placed in the Bible between the Old and the New Testaments, but were still considered a part of the Old. Yeah. So, and then what happened about in around the 1800s, mid 1800s or so, is when the British Public Bible Society decided to take those books out of the Bible altogether, because they didn't think that they were somewhat inspired, or even because of economics, because it was more cost efficient to take those, since those books were already an intertestamental section of the Bible, that they would just take those books out, and they would just have the old, what we know today as the Old and the New Testament, the 66 books of the Bible, that we get the standard version. And I guess what's interesting to say about that is that in the King James Bible, when the King James, he was Protestant, when he ordered the translation of the Bible from, the Greek and the Hebrew into English, Old English, they originally had the Apocrypha. So I even have it. It's a extra, when you buy a King James Bible, they don't have it. They don't have the Apocrypha included. They just have the Old and the New Testament. But what you can do is you can buy a King James Bible Apocrypha separately. And that's kind of an interesting thing to have in your possession, because you're reading the Apocrypha in the King James Version, in the Old English. So it's pretty amazing. I have another Apocrypha book. I think it's the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version. That's actually a pretty good translation, honestly. So I would recommend, if anybody wants to read the Apocrypha, if anybody's interested, the new revised NRSV, New Revised Standard Version, is a pretty good translation from into English. It's not watered down. It's a pretty accurate translation. It's easy to read, and the message comes across very clearly. So I recommend that to anybody who's interested in purchasing an Apocrypha. And then later on down the line, if you want to take a dive, take a chance and get the King James Apocrypha. It's a little bit more difficult to read, but it's actually more, if you study, it's more for like an intense study, like a critical thinking, to break that down. That's more of a scholarly thing to do. Uh, but yeah, it's up to the individual what they most feel comfortable with. But one thing I'll say, talking about translations or versions of the Bible, probably the worst translation, in my opinion, of the English translation is the NIV, and that's the New International Version. And no harm to people that like the NIV and like it because it's easy to read, it's easier to understand, but that's just it. Because it's so quote unquote easy to understand, it's because it's so watered down and it's dumbed down. They've made it to where there's so many like it's like you're taking away all the juice from that original meaning. And I guess maybe with people that are just new to Bible reading and growing up in modern society, maybe the NIV would be the best thing to start off with, possibly. Uh, I don't know, but I mean, I think that if you're gonna read it as the first thing, maybe that's a good way to start. But I wouldn't stop there because if you go back, if you go read other translations, English translations, they're a lot more. The juice is there, but like with the NIV, it's just really watered down. And I can understand how some people can't understand the Old English. Don't get me wrong. I mean, for me, for my life has been a little bit different. I was given a King James Bible when I was like 9 years old, and I started, and I so growing up as a kid, as a 9-year-old kid reading the Bible for the first time, I was reading the Old English, and yeah, at the first when I started reading, I was like, I couldn't understand it really 100%, but I could tell what I got out of it was that this is a more archaic, not just an archaic language, but it gave me a better understanding of how people spoke in biblical times, and that's conveyed with that Old English because that Old English is more of like a more ancient way of English, and that's a more ancient way of speaking that the people in the times of the Bible were. So the modern ways, the modern English or the modern culture is a lot different from that ancient culture, the way people spoke. And so I guess that King James Bible comes through that way.
What dialect do you think is the closest to Hebrew? Is it like Greek or English, the Old English? Like,
I think the closest dialect to from Hebrew to another language, you mean?
yeah, yeah. Well, like to from going to Hebrew, like if you're trying to get
Uh,
the closest, meaning of the Bible, which way would you go?
Probably the best thing to do to find the best meaning of the Bible for the Old Testament. It's kind of weird, but you might have to learn ancient Greek because to learn to read the Septuagint, and then you'd also have to learn, and then for um, even for the New Testament to get the best dialect, you would have to learn, you'd have to know ancient Greek because that's what the New Testament was written in originally. So maybe so really probably the two things to do, and this is one thing that I'm starting to do now, is starting to learn Hebrew and Greek for a better understanding of those languages,
So you can
the
bounce,
original.
so you can see them,
Yes,
like contrast them together, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
And like I said earlier, it's by looking at different first off by looking at different translations of the Bible, studying, comparing them side by side, you can get a better understanding of the meaning of the Bible, like that. I call it the juice, the spirit of that. You get that better idea comes across, that more purest word comes through by like looking at the various translations, but by going through our versions of the Bible. But if you go into the original languages, that opens up a whole new door. Then you can really get into the meat and really see and really get that deeper meaning, really deeper understanding of what that ancient message was that the Bible was originally written in. So it's deep. It's deep. It's really deep. You know, yes, and that's the thing. If somebody's writing about the Greek and the Hebrew, and talking about the numbers, that's true. Like ancient Hebrew, even modern Hebrew, for every word or for every letter, there's a word, there's a number designated to it. So even though it's like it's no, it's letters, but it's also math embedded. So it's like there's a numerical value for things. And it's interesting talking about the Greek and the Hebrew, and going back about how I talked about Proto-Canaanite. It's believed that before that people were thinking that Phoenicia, the Phoenicians, were the ones that had invented the alphabet. That's where we get the term phonetics, or hooked on phonics, and it comes from Phoenicia with the alphabet, because it's believed that the Phoenicians invented the alphabet. But what I'm finding out is that in more ancient documents, and what we're finding out with even with these writings of Proto-Canaanite in the caves in the Sinai Peninsula, for dating back 2,500 years ago, uh, maybe even longer, 1,300, 3,500 years ago, you're finding out that it was actually the Hebrews, the Hebrew-speaking people, that introduced that alphabet to the Phoenicians, and through the Phoenicians to the Greeks. And there's evidence of this because if you look at the first four letters of the Hebrew alphabet and compare it with the first four letters of the Greek alphabet, it's almost the same pronunciation. It's like, okay, you get, okay, I'll tell, just to hear me out. The first four letters of the Hebrew alphabet are Aleph, Bet, Gimel, and Dalet. Okay? And in Greek, the first four letters are Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta. So you have a B, a G, and a D. That's the same. And they're even similar. Alpha and Aleph, Bet and Beta. That's where you get alpha, beta, alphabet. you know, it's all there. So that's interesting that there's these uh, language, there's these root, what's the word I'm looking for? The root. There's a foundation of languages between the Hebrew and the Greek, even though that the Hebrew is different from the Greek. But there's some commonality. There's some connections there, even though they're two different languages from two different races of people. But there's a continuity there between the two, and that kind of shows you that that's kind of an evidence that possibly, if that ancient writing that says that the Jews or the Hebrews gave the language, the alphabet, to the Phoenicians, and then through the Phoenicians, through the trading with the Greeks, that's how the Greeks got it. So when the Greeks wrote down their alphabet, it was similar to the Hebrew alphabet, and that would make a good case for what has been written about how it was actually the Israelites, the Jews, that gave the writing language to the Phoenicians, and then the Phoenicians to the Greeks. So this is really interesting stuff, you know. And that's what I tell people is that like when you read the Bible, or when somebody talks about the Bible, maybe people that weren't raised in a family that was church going or whatever. Some people say, "Oh yeah, the Bible, just a bunch of fairy tales. It's something you tell your kids in Sunday school." It's just they just kind of pass over like it's nothing too advanced. But that's the total opposite. I mean, the Bible is so deep, and the languages. That's why I wanted to make this podcast, to just specifically talk about the Bible, and all the different languages how the languages evolved over time, all the different translations, the different versions of the Bible. It really goes deep, and even if you're not interested to read the Bible, just the history of how it all came together, that should be fascinating to anybody uh, that's interested in history, or anything in this world that's come down to us, as far, even if you want to look at it as just literary art. That's even in a lot of writers, uh, mention use the Bible in their writings as like motifs, symbolism, just as they would use ancient myths, like uh, like Egyptian religion, like Isis, Osiris. People mention those in their writings, and people reference the Bible too. you know. So even if you don't necessarily, some people that even don't necessarily believe in the Bible, but because it's left such a mark, it's been such a hallmark of Western culture for the past 500 years that there's really no way you can get around it. You know, living in the West. You know, there's even a college class I took called Bible in Western Culture, that talked about that, about how you had the history of the Bible, how it came down to us, and all the different translations and everything, and how that affected Western society. You know, with like you have America, with you have the Puritans, the people that first came to America and established America. You know, the founding fathers. You know, they wrote. You know, Thomas Jefferson, he wrote his own Bible. You know, but even though he didn't believe in everything the Bible said, at least he was still reading it. You know, so even if you don't believe in it, people, that's the point that I'm trying to make. Even if you don't believe in it, it's still a part of our culture. You know, you can't really get away from it, really. But yeah, but talking about the number system with Hebrew, yeah, there's Hebrew is just like a long string of numbers. Like if you look at the that's why there's some people that try to make the Bible code, try to make prophecy, that's what you call gematria, when you have what you might call it, uh you have a string of numbers, or you have or a string of letters that add up that adds up to a certain number, and that has a deeper meaning as well. So you don't just have a meaning in words, but you have a meaning in numbers. So that's how deep it goes, you know. So you have the numerical significance as well as the literary significance. So you're not just using so the writing of the Bible isn't just literary; it's also mathematics. You know, so you're using both the literary part of your brain and the mathematical part of your brain. So this is like it's like a wholesome, it's like you're using, it's almost like being whole. Like they say some people are left brained, some people are right brained, and some people are called whole brained where they use both sides of their brain. So really studying Hebrew or the ancient languages can really, uh, that can really blow your mind. That can really make you a whole person, even just like it stimulates brain cells. I guess you could say, for lack of a better term, but it makes you use both sides of your brain, so that you're really getting deep into this, and the wisdom that comes through from reading the Bible, from studying the Bible, even if you don't understand it at first, but if you keep reading it, eventually you'll catch on, and it really will, like, make you wise. And not only just reading the Bible, but that's the one thing. Just looking at it for literature, but there's a different there's that's one side of the coin. But to actually do what the Bible says, that's another thing. You know, so see, we don't just read it, but we actually try to apply it to our life. And then it's not just our brain that's engaged; it's also our heart. And if our heart's in the right place with God, and we can open up our lives to God and follow His commandments, which are written in the Bible, and we read the Bible and we apply it to our life, and then the Spirit of God, the grace of God, can come to us, and that'll make us very wise. You know, because we're not just thinking with a human way of thought, but a godly. We become godly people, and that's the whole reason why the Bible was written in the first place, to make us that way. The Bible wasn't written just for, just as for nice stories, to have a literary culture, uh, but it's for our salvation. You know, to make us right with God, to open our hearts that we'll be obedient to God as servants of God, and make us people of God. You know, that's the whole reason why, that's why it's called the Word of God, is that we study, we understand. By understanding the Word of God, we can become more godly people and become right with God and fulfill the commandments. And Bob's your uncle. You know, we become sanctified. That's the word I'm looking for, sanctified. That's what becomes sanctification. So it's not just education, but through reading the Bible is also sanctification. We become holy, and that's what, the Bible says. Be holy, as God says, be holy, for I am holy. You know, that's and so really, understanding the Bible can transmit a certain amount of holiness to the human being, and it purges us of sin, and we become more righteous people, and that's the whole point. That's the whole point that the Bible was written, so that we would know the Word of God, so that we could be better people. Yep. Somebody's talking about the fire of if they existed, it would be burned in the library when the Library of Alexandria was burned. Well, yes and no. Uh, Even though the book of the Library of Alexandria was burned and all the the documents were destroyed, because they didn't just have one copy of the Septuagint. Okay, it wasn't just you wouldn't just found at the Library of Alexandria. It was like what they do to Bibles today, where they pass them out. Like there's copies of the Septuagint all throughout uh, the Jewish areas of the Eastern Mediterranean in that time. They just didn't have one. They didn't. You didn't have to just go to the Library of Alexandria to get a copy of the Septuagint. It was distributed um, throughout the Greek speaking peoples, the Jewish people that spoke Greek in that time. For example, in Jesus' day, I'm sure they had, even in the Temple of Jerusalem, I'm sure they had a copy of the Septuagint, even though they were probably uh, teaching in Greek. I mean, in Hebrew. I'm pretty sure that they would have known. The Pharisees were highly educated people. I'm sure that they didn't have a. I'm sure they had a copy of the Septuagint. It's probably without a doubt. Older than the Septuagint. There's no older Greek text. There's no Greek text of the Bible older than the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the oldest text that we have of the Bible that's been translated into Greek. Before that, there wasn't a Greek translation of the Bible, except for maybe the Apocrypha. But the Apocrypha was written a little bit after the Septuagint was translated. So it's not exactly so really the oldest is the Septuagint, but there's not an older version of the Greek version of the scriptures, the Bible, Hebrew, before that. And then but again, the mystery is what was the original Hebrew? Because the Hebrew that we read today, the block Hebrew, or the square Hebrew as it's called, that's not the same as the Proto-Canaanite script that Moses would have been writing when he wrote down the Torah, and then they had the prophets. They were reading. They may have been writing a Hebrew similar to what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That might be the only that's probably the most ancient form of Hebrew that we know of is from the Dead Sea Scroll library, and that can be read by modern Hebrew speakers. It's a little bit different. So what were the Ten Commandments written in? They were written in, they were pro, they again, it was probably written in what they called the Proto-Canaanite script, which was a form of Hebrew. I've seen the writing, what they call Proto-Canaanite, and it does look like Hebrew, but it's a little bit I shouldn't say cruder, but it's just a little bit it's just a little bit. It's kind of like how you'd have like Old English versus modern English. Like you have the Old English writing, that's just more a little bit fancier, more a little bit classic. Yeah, that's a good way. It's more of a classical written form, and then you have the modern English. That again is like the square characters. So that's probably how you would look at the original Hebrew, or the ancient Hebrew. It's more like an Old English versus modern English, and you have the ancient Hebrew versus the block Hebrew. That's like the difference between the two, as far as I know. But as far as what the original, I can't say for a fact, not at this point anyway. But what I do know is that the original Hebrew that the Bible was written in, the Old Testament, it's not the same script. Even though you could probably still read it, it's not exactly the same script that they use today to write Hebrew, to write the Bible. But but uh, but the oldest that we have is the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that can still be read. There's even people that can read the Aramaic. Some of the Dead Sea Scrolls were written in Aramaic, and even though Aramaic is basically a dead language, there are classicists. There are people today in universities that can read Aramaic. That's how they were able to translate the Dead Sea Scrolls into English. That's another thing too, because these are the oldest forms of the Bible that we have, and it's amazing that they were able not only to decipher the Hebrew and the Aramaic and the Greek, but they were also able to translate it into English, which was which which helps people that don't have the means or the time or the effort or the time to or uh the leisure to go and learn Hebrew and Greek to read to know what the Bible says. They have these scholars that have translated into English for us, and they're pretty good translations, I will have to say. And it gives us a better understanding of what those scriptures meant. And that's right. In the Passion of the Christ, they did use Aramaic. Yeah, that's an amazing thing too. When that's one thing I liked about the Passion of the Christ that Mel Gibson did was that he allowed them to be spoken. He allowed that to be spoken in that original language. That's the point that I'm. That's the reason why I made this podcast too, is to go deeper into the original language of the Bible, and that's what Mel Gibson did with the Passion. And what's interesting, they spoke Aramaic, which is a dialect of Hebrew or Arabic. And there's some people that told me, some people from Lebanon told me that when they watched the Passion of the Christ, they could actually catch some of the stuff that they were saying in Aramaic, even though it was a different dialect than Arabic. But there were some things that they could catch, and they actually learned a little bit how to speak Aramaic just by watching the Passion of the Christ. And then, of course, the Roman soldiers, they spoke Latin. I don't know. I'm not too sure if there was any Greek speaking in the Passion of the Christ, but I know that they spoke. It was the Jesus and the disciples were portrayed speaking Aramaic, and then the Roman soldiers were speaking Latin. Yeah, so that was pretty cool. That even Mel Gibson, when he made his movie, he made it very authentic to like as the time that even he even made the movie with them speaking those original languages, which is pretty interesting. So yes. So anybody you had
I
something?
was gonna say, did you think Passion of the Christ actually was kind of a Catholic? Was it presented
Yes,
in a Catholic way more so
it
than?
was. It was presented in a Catholic way. Uh, and I'll say this: not only was it presented in a Catholic way, but it was also presented from a Catholic saint who claimed that they had went back in time spiritually to the time of Christ to when the Passion took place. And then when she awoke from her vision, she wrote it down, and that's called the Dolores Passion. And Mel Gibson got a lot of that movie from that book. That it's a Catholic book called the Dolores Passion. And it's interesting that I found that out later because even though I'm a believer, I'm a Christian, I'm an Orthodox Christian, I believe in Christ. At the time I watched the Passion of the Christ, I wasn't Orthodox. I hadn't converted yet. I was still Protestant. But when I watched it, even though I was a believer, and I really loved that movie, Jesus of Nazareth, that was made in the '70s. When I watched the Passion of the Christ, I didn't like it. I'm just going to be honest. I really didn't. There was not all of it. There were some things that I did like, but overall, I wasn't happy, honestly, with a lot of the things in the Passion of the Christ. I liked how they used the original languages. Some historical things were there that I enjoyed. There were some things that I gained from it, but a lot of it I didn't like. And then it was later on that I found out that Mel Gibson, he didn't just take it from the Bible, but he took a lot of it from, like you said, from a Catholic perspective, and going even further, from a Catholic document, from a Catholic saint that said that they went back in time to that and wrote down what really happened. So I don't know. That's another thing. Did you have something, Tim?
I was just gonna say, it almost seemed like it was for shock value, or like if you've ever seen
Yeah,
Clockwork Orange, like you know how he was
yeah, I
reading the
saw that.
Bible to get the like the thrill.
Yeah, it was like I think it was a little bit too exaggerated. Like when they beat Christ, like the way that they showed Christ before he was even crucified, how they were beating him with the sticks and then with the cat of nine tails. I think that was kind of like over the top, honestly. It's like you
Comic
don't.
book.
It's like you're. Yeah,
But
it's like well, look, there's that one scene, like when the whip it goes onto his rib cage and then they pull it off and then like part of the flesh of Christ's ribs gets pulled off. It's like, come on, that was a little bit too much, And like I said, I'm a believer. I was a, I, I mean, I grew up in the church and I loved Christ, but when I saw that movie, I really didn't like it. It was weird because After the movie in the theater, I saw, and after the movie, after the resurrection scene, the credits started. Everybody in the church, everybody in the church, everybody in the theater started clapping, but I didn't clap. I did not clap. You know, I
Yeah, I felt the same way too.
well, one thing I didn't like also was like, go ahead, 10. You had something, 10 point?
Well, the coolest part of the story is the resurrection part, and it seems as though they just cut it off. Like,
I know. Well, and that's another part. I had a problem with that too because when when Jesus rose from the dead, you see the grave clothes, you see the scene where the stone rolls away, the sunlight comes through, and then it pans over to the grave clothes, and it looks like he just resurrected in there, and they're like folding like in the wind, uh, and when they showed Christ, he's naked, and then when he gets up, you see the forgive me for being so crude, but you see like the bottom of his his behind. It's like, come on, man. So you're going to tell me that when Jesus rose from the dead, he was naked? I mean, I think every vision that people have had of Christ, he's been fully clothed. In the book of Revelation, he talks about him. He's got a robe down to his feet. And none of his body is exposed except for his hands and his feet, and of course his face. So why would you depict Christ as being naked? And then he walks, and then he gets up, and you see the part of his bottom of his behind, and then he walks out of the tomb. So you're going to tell me that Jesus walked out of the tomb naked? I didn't like that. That's just me, but
yeah, it wasn't. It was maybe something that Mel Gibson threw in there for himself.
I
Maybe
don't know.
there's
I
something
have
because he's
I
kind of
have
weird
no
like.
I have no idea why he did that, you know? Because even okay, look, if Christ rose from the dead, well, he did rise from the dead, but if he why would you I don't there would there would be burial robes or wrappings at the very least. Well, there would have been something because okay, yes, we know that Christ was crucified naked. On the crucifix we see, he's wearing a loincloth, but really that's just a way to protect Christ's dignity. But when Christ was when anybody in the Roman Empire in the ancient times was crucified, they were all naked. They didn't have any clothes. They took all their clothes off. That was another way to humiliate them. That's what crucifixion it wasn't just a death, but it was a humiliating death. And part of that humiliation was you're naked. So
And they
yes, so
auctioned your clothes off too.
you're right. They drew cast lots, like it says in the Romans, the soldiers. They cast lots for Jesus's robe. But then what was it? So yeah. So okay, Jesus rises from the dead. Yeah, and and you want to talk about the shroud of Turin? That's a whole other topic. But okay, he comes out of the grave clothes, right? And so say that when he rose from the dead and he comes out of the grave clothes, he's naked. But well, we don't know that. We don't know what he was. He had some type of covering,
Who
because
who
he
has
has a
his
human nature.
who has
Go
his
ahead.
clothes? Who has his clothes? The clothes
Well,
the
that's
Romans stole.
interesting.
Who's in possession of those?
Well, that's interesting because there's a legend that's come down to us that says that the robe of Christ was taken to the country of Georgia, which is in the Caucasus. It's an Orthodox country. It's a Orthodox Christian country. Has been and debatably it's one of the oldest Orthodox Christian countries in the world. And Georgia is in between the Black and Caspian Seas off the Caucasus Mountains. It's right next to it's north of Armenia. It borders Turkey to the south and Russia to the north. And they believe that's where Christ's robe went to after they believe that some Jew there was a group of Jews from living in Georgia that they were visiting Jerusalem at the time of Christ's crucifixion. And it's believed there's a story I have the book. It's called the Lives of the Georgian Saints, or the Legends of the Georgian Saints, and that Jesus's robe was actually was taken possession of by the Jews of Georgia, and then they brought it back to Georgia, and it's buried there in Georgia. They built a church over it. So these are just, but that's for a whole other topic. But that's what they think happened to the robe of Christ was that uh, it ended up in the country of Georgia. Yeah. And then, but again, going back to the resurrection, to be naked, it was a shameful because Christ now has a human nature. He's a human body. It will be shameful for him to be seen naked. Just like he was on the cross. So when he rose from the dead, I really doubt that when Christ stepped out of the tomb, he was butt naked. I don't even like saying that word next to Christ, let alone seeing Christ that way, and that was shown in the Passion. So I don't think that there's any way that he would have left the tomb without some type of cloth on himself, covering.
Actually wasn't the guy who played Jesus. Wasn't he an actor in some other movie? Or I think he did something similar, or where he but maybe it was what was his name? I can't remember his name.
Jim Caviezel.
Yeah, yeah. Isn't he kind of known for being something like that? Like, because he's like a Hollywood person, so So that maybe that's what I was thinking is when I saw that too, I was like, well, that's all Hollywooded out, like
Yeah,
nudity
that's
and stuff
so.
like that.
Well, I don't know. I don't know about his past movies. I know I saw one movie with him, I think before the Passion. Yeah, it was a movie. I can't remember the name. It had Ashley Judd in it. He played like some kind of a guy in the army. But as far as him being nude in his movies, that I'm not too sure of. But I just didn't like how. Again, there's even a book written called The Poison and the Passion, to where people point out some things that they didn't like, and they were Christian writers. Christian, again, we're believers. I'm a believer, and I'm criticizing. I'm a Christian. I'm criticizing the Passion of the Christ movie. There's some things I did like. Don't get me wrong, but overall, like when after the movie came out and it came out on DVD, and people were buying the DVD and like, oh, I got the Passion, this and that. I never bought a copy. I don't have a copy in my library. I don't. I saw it actually twice in the theater. I saw it for the second time, but then I never saw it uh, on DVD or whatever. But yeah, twice was enough. And but yeah, so I really don't think that we don't know what exactly happened when Christ rose from the dead, or all that was involved. We just know that it was miraculous. But I really doubt that when he came out of the tomb, he was naked. I really can't accept that.
Well,
Even
not
when
to
the
mention
Go ahead.
he had the two Mary and then they were there at the front of the tomb too,
Right,
so that
right.
would make it
That's
even
what
more awkward.
Right, that's what I was just about to say, because when Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and she was crying and she didn't see Christ in there, and then there was a man, it was Christ behind her, said, Woman, why are you weeping?" And she thought he was a gardener. So if she thought he was a gardener, uh clothes, and the
Something.
clothing that he was, must have been wearing humble clothing, because she didn't think he was any kind of ruling, like he wasn't like dressed like a king. He was just dressed in humble clothes, to where she thought he was just a blue, like what we know as a blue collar worker. He wasn't dressed all fancy. So that just shows you the humility of Christ, the humbleness of Christ. But there's a certain amount of dignity involved in the person of God and person of Christ, that he wouldn't be walking around naked. Come on. Even when the two disciples met him on the road to Emmaus, and his appearance was that they didn't recognize him. He was in a different form, but he had clothes. He was wearing clothes, you know. But anyway, that's about all I wanted to say. Go ahead. You got something, 10 point?
Just a quick conjecture, the fact that they didn't recognize him, just it's possible that the Romans ripped his beard off during the and if you've ever noticed someone who's
No,
you
no,
don't think that it was his beard?
no, no. The reason, look, the thing, look, even if they did rip his beard off when they saw him on the road to Emmaus, this is after the resurrection. After the resurrection, I'm pretty sure, even if they did rip his beard off at the crucifixion, which I don't believe they did, but even if they did, at the resurrection, he would have had his beard. But the reason, what I've always thought that they didn't recognize him, was that he may have appeared to them as an older man, or because, like they said, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem?" And it was just a way
Oh,
that their eyes were like, they didn't recognize him. But when they invited him in, to stay with them, to eat dinner, And when he broke bread, then their eyes were open and they revealed. Then they knew it was Christ, and then he disappeared from them. And it's mentioned in Luke's gospel, and then again in another gospel it says how he appeared to two. It doesn't tell the story, but it just says that he appeared to two of his disciples in another form. It does say that in another gospel.
Mhm. And then they saw the holes in his hands. Yeah, that's the
Well,
little
that's
more
just it.
identifying.
See, that's just it. Because when he was in the other form, he didn't have the holes in his hand. Because if he did, they would have noticed them. They would have recognized him right away. So you
Oh.
see, Jesus has that ability. I mean, he's God. He can do all things. If he appeared to them in a different form, he didn't have the wounds. But then when he came up to Thomas, when Thomas says, "I won't believe that he rose unless I put my finger in the print of his nails, or put my hand in his side." And then when Jesus appeared to Thomas, he shows so hey, he says, "Here's my side. Put your hand here." And then Thomas said, "My Lord and my God." You know. So sometimes Christ did appear with his wounds, and sometimes he didn't. Because when in John's gospel, when Christ was when they were fishing at night, and then they saw this man on the shore, and he says, "Children, do you have any meat?" And they says, "We've been toiling all night. We haven't caught anything." He goes, "Cast on the right side of the ship, and you will find." And then they pulled in all this net of fish. And then John, the apostle John, he realized, wait a second, that's the Lord. And then he told it to Peter, and then Peter recognized it was him, and then he was naked. It says, and he put his fisher's coat around himself, and then jumped into the sea, into the lake of Galilee, Sea of Galilee. So yeah, so even there's the so we're here we see two separate times when Christ appeared to them in a different form, in a way that maybe he appeared in a way that they weren't, that he, and spiritually speaking, that he blinded their eyes in a way that they didn't recognize him. But it was only after the miracle happened that John recognized him, and then Peter recognized him. And then when they came onto the shore, it says that he was still in a different form, but nobody asked him who he was, because they all, out of fear, knew that it was the Lord. But he was just in a different form. So what that form was, we really don't know. I've always thought, just as this is my own opinion, I could be wrong, but I've thought that maybe Christ appeared as an older man, like with long white hair, long white beard. And the reason why I say that is because in the book of Revelation, Christ is described as having hair white like wool, not woolly hair, not hair like wool, but white like wool. So Christ was appeared to John in the Revelation with white hair. That was a different form, because we know that Christ died in his mid-30s, 33 years old. So he probably wouldn't have had white hair. He would have had, darker hair. So it was really, so that's just my own opinion, is that when Christ appeared to them in different forms, that he may have been appeared as an older man, that they didn't recognize him as, the young man Jesus.
That's interesting because most of the archetype of like the mythology is that the god comes disguised as an older person that nobody
Right,
recognizes until
right,
later.
right, right. That's exactly right. That's what's got me thinking. Like, in other parts of the Bible, Christ is, he's called the Ancient of Days. So he would be like God, as this old man, sitting on a throne. That's a classic archetype of God. So anyway, I guess we're almost about at an hour now. I didn't want to go too long, but I think we made some good points. I mean, I think this could go for some our own personal study, as far as the different languages, translations, and versions of the Bible that we have. So really, um, even though we can't, even those things, some things have been lost in translation. At the same time, I think what's happened. I think that what's safe to say is that the spirit of the message, the main things of the message that God wanted to tell people, that has come through, even if there have been misinterpretations, or I should say mistranslations or errors or whatever. I think for the most part, the gospel message has been preached. People know somewhat about, have some type of faith, have some type of understanding of who God is, or have, and I think that's, like living in Western culture for anyways, like Europe and America and stuff like that. So we have that message has come through, even if it has been different denominations, like specifically Protestant. That's what we get mostly in Western culture, is an understanding of the Bible through a Protestant lens. Uh, but even that's not too far off. We know about the message of salvation has come. Christ was the Son of God, died for our sins, rose from the third day according to the scriptures. And it's interesting because when the Nicene Creed was written in 325 AD, that was written before the New Testament canon was established. There was books circulating, but there was no New Testament that we have today when the Creed was written. So when the Creed in the Creed, when it's written where it says, "And Christ rose from the dead on the third day according to the scriptures," they're not talking about the New Testament, they're talking about the Old Testament, because it was prophesied in the Old Testament how the Messiah would come. And as Christ in the different form was on the road to Emmaus and he opened up the scriptures and told them, starting at the prophets, he explained to them all the things that the Christ would have to suffer through them, and he explained to them all the prophecies that Christ fulfilled. So all those things in the Old Testament that were pointing to Christ, Christ fulfilled that. And so when it says he rose again according to the scriptures, they're referring to the Old Testament, not just the New, because the New Testament wasn't. They had the books were circulating, but there was no set canon yet. That did this. The canon of the New Testament didn't get established until almost in about 397, so almost 400 AD, before we had the New Testament canon that we have today. And it was the Orthodox. It was the Christian. It was the bishops that came. Saint Athanasios, again, a saint of the church, was the one that put the New Testament canon together. That established that what we have, because they had some other gospels that going around. We call them the Gnostic gospels, and that's a whole nother topic right there. Just talking about the Gnostics and what they had, and the kind of Bibles that they were reading, and those were lost for a long time until 1945. Just like the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think were found in 1947 in the caves of Qumran near the Dead Sea by a Bedouin shepherd, and then the Gnostic Gospels were found by an Egyptian peasant digging for fertilizer in Upper Egypt in 1945. So you had the discovery. So within just a couple of years, you had the discovery of these ancient Christian documents as well as these ancient Jewish documents. So those are two, that's the beautiful thing about living in the modern world, uh, where things are so much easier. Like information is so easier to access. We can really, 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 really go deep into the understanding of almost a better understanding than some of the older Christians from ancient times would know in some ways, or we at least have that ability to study them and get better acquainted with that purest idea. Uh, that the idea that God was trying to get across, that inspiration, that pure breath of God, that inspiration of the Holy Scriptures, from looking at the vast array of books that have come down to us in the modern times, and even the Gnostic Gospels that I don't believe are. I can understand. I've read some of the Gnostic Gospels, and I can see how they would be like, they would deviate from the teachings of the church, because there's a certain amount of philosophy involved. There's a certain amount of, even, I wouldn't say magic, but like mysticism. There's a certain amount of mysticism involved with the Gnostic Gospels. That's why they're called Gnostic. And Nag Hammadi, yeah. And so there's that in Upper Egypt where they were found. So that's like, I can understand why those those book those books were excluded from the New Testament canon, because they were just a little bit too out there. But the fact of the matter is that if you're a staunch believer and you're versed in the scriptures, if you can read some of the Gnostic Gospels, you can at least read them that way you won't be influenced by their heretical teachings, but it will give you a better understanding of what people believed in the ancient times, even if you don't personally believe it yourself. Even if it was a false teaching, just the fact to know that even if you don't believe what other people believe in, but just having that, but just knowing that is enlightening as well, because it opens your eyes and it lets you see what other beliefs people have, you know, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's all these things that I've talked about today. It's all education. It's all spiritual education that gives us a better understanding of the truth, and that's the point of all the biblical translations and languages, is to get that truth out. Is that the Bible is the Word of God? It's the Word of truth. Even Christ said that in John's Gospel, chapter 17, verse 17. He's praying for his disciples. He says, "Sanctify them through thy truth, for thy word is truth." and that's what we stand on as the Word of God. Is that it's the truth. So if anybody has any, and oh, real quick, Maccabees. Yeah, Maccabees is apocryphal. Yeah, Maccabees was originally written in Greek, and it's more of a history than it is a. There's God involved. They rededicate the altar. I think the last I'm glad you mentioned that, because last time in episode 2 of the Leap of Faith podcast, I said the temple was destroyed and then rebuilt. It wasn't the temple; it was the altar that was desecrated, and so they destroyed the old altar and they rebuilt it, and then that's why they called it. That's how they rededicated the altar, and that's why Hanukkah is called the dedication. You know that the on the on the day of on the ninth day, I think it's the, don't get me wrong, it's in the month of Chislev, and that they celebrate Hanukkah, you know, around December of the Gregorian calendar, the Christians.
Who was that one, the king who set himself up to desecrated the altar in the first place? I want to say
That
it
was
was
Antiochus Epiphanes.
Antiochus. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Epiphanes was just his nickname, but he actually
sort
went
of. Well,
by
he
something
kind of
else.
he Antiochus. He was known as Antiochus the Fourth, and he called himself Epiphanes because he believed himself to be divine. And if you've heard the term epiphany, it's like you get a revelation from God. Well, basically, he thought he was a god himself. But the other people in his kingdom, they didn't really like him. They called him some other word that meant madman. He wasn't really that popular even amongst his generals, even because he was just so full of himself. But yeah, it was Antiochus the Fourth that was the one that desecrated the altar, and it's believed that he sacrificed a pig. That's what that's and that's that, I mean that's I mean to call somebody a pig in the Middle East, that's a real big insult. And then to take a pig and slaughter it on the altar, that's no wonder it was desecrated, that they couldn't believe that happened. They weren't even supposed to eat pork. This is not just the Muslims, but even the Jews. Even to this day, don't eat pork because it's an unclean animal. So to sacrifice, they sacrifice, goats or lambs, bullocks, but they would never sacrifice an unclean animal. So the fact that that Antiochus sacrificed an unclean animal and going even further, the unclean animal was a pig. That was, total blasphemy. That's what they call it. I think in the King James Apocrypha, it's called the abomination of desolation. And
Oh
that's what
wow.
and yeah, so that's why they had to rededicate the altar. They tore down the old altar and they rebuilt it, and that was in the Second Temple period that happened. But yeah, Maccabees is considered Apocrypha, and yeah.
That's the only other apocrypha that I know of that's actually like uh, wholesome, and it has actually like people behind it saying, "Oh yeah, this actually did happen," and this
Yeah,
it seems more historic.
yeah, it's more historic. I think it is. I think for the most part, it's pretty accurate. Honestly, it's accurate history. Um, and as far as the apocrypha is concerned, there's a certain amount of books that are held as apocrypha. But when it comes to another group of works called the pseudepigrapha, that's like additional apocrypha books that weren't included in the Bible, or what you want to call lost books of the Bible. But what you'll find these pseudepigraphas, or these deuterocanonical books, another long word, is that there's no accepted set canon. There's not like a certain there's all kinds out there. Like you have like the Testament of Moses, or also known as the Assumption of Moses. That's not enlisted in the mainstream apocrypha. That's like what you call, those are extra books, what you call deuterocanonical books, or pseudepigrapha. The Book of Enoch, for example, that's also considered pseudepigrapha. You won't find the Book of Enoch in the apocrypha of the King James, but you'll find it in the Ethiopian canon. Even Second Enoch is in the Ethiopian canon. Um, but then there's all kinds of books. There's a Testament of Abraham, uh, the Epistle to
Oh,
Barnabas.
I never heard of that
All
one.
these, yeah. There's all. Like I said, there's a lot of different types of. There's like, again, even somebody asked this online recently. There's a book that I bought recently called it's called the Complete 54 Book Apocrypha, where it has both the apocryphal books, the Old and even the New Testament. But then when you look then you'll see. But then somebody was saying, had a question, say, well, I saw that book, the book that I bought that we were talking about, and then there's another book coming out that says there's even there's like a 60-something book Apocrypha. So it's like, well, which one is it? And that's what we have to realize is that when it comes to the pseudepigrapha, all the like the lost books of the Bible, like you even have like the book of Adam and Eve, for example. You have all these extra biblical books that weren't in the Bible, but it's hard to pinpoint an exact number or have like a canon, like a fixed canon of the Apocrypha or pseudepigrapha because there's just so much there's just so much out there. And yeah, and that's another reason, like you call it fan fiction, that like the book of Adam and Eve, that's total fan fiction. I mean, I guess there's some things you can learn from it, but it's really not necessary because there's a lot of it's just it goes from like you have the Bible, you have the history, you have the writings, you have the prophets. It's all for edification. Whereas a lot of these other books that's probably why they didn't make it into the Bible is because it was more fantasy than fiction, and it was more literary freedom, literary license involved than actual Word of God edification going on. You know what I mean? So that's another reason why those books were left out. But one thing I will say about the Book of Adam and Eve, I read it before, and the interesting thing about it is one thing that I got out of it. There's always something that you can glean from these books. You can't accept everything as a gospel truth, but there's some things you can pick out. And one thing is that it says that after 5,500 years with the Christ incarnate, and that's interesting because that term 5,500 BC for the creation of Adam, that goes lock, stock, and barrel with Orthodox theology that says that Adam was the first, that humanity was created in 5,500 BC. So that's something that we found in an ancient document that is congruent, has continuity with Orthodox Christianity, with the history of the Orthodox, as the Orthodox see it. So that's interesting. But anyway, I guess that's about it, guys. If anybody else has any question, real quick, got anything 10 point? Any extra
Thinking
input?
about that word or the number 5, because it seems as though there's a tie to books, like you have the 5 books of
Well, there's a lot
the
of
Torah.
there's you have a lot of when it comes to numbers, again, you have you have the 12, like the number 12. You have 12 apostles. You had 12 tribes of Israel, 12 months in a year. You have the 5 books of Moses. Then you have and then when David went to slay Goliath, he went to the brook and he found 5 smooth stones. He didn't just have one smooth; he had 5. So that's that number 5 comes up again. So you'll see that all throughout Scripture, is that there's certain numbers that are associated. I wouldn't say holiness, but there's a certain significance behind these numbers, and that's probably another reason why that there's a numerical value associated with each letter in Hebrew as well. To where and that's what you call gematria, to where you can take a number, even the number 666 is the Bible says is the number of a man, and his number is 603 score and six. So and it's what's interesting, and that's what's interesting about that number 666 in the Bible, is that in the mark of the beast, you can't buy or sell without that number, and the Antichrist has that number, and he's worshipped in the temple. And then what do we see in the Old Testament? The amount of gold that came to Solomon in a year was 666 talents. So you have the temple, the money, the king, and the 666. So there's a mystery behind that. I'd like to get into this sometime. I'm planning to make a video or a paper called "The Temple of Solomon and the Garden of Eden," and I'm going to be talking about how the Temple of Solomon was built to basically represent the Garden of Eden. And when Adam, it says in the Bible, in Genesis, when God put Adam there to till and to keep the garden, it wasn't just to work and planting crops or whatever, but the tilling and the keeping meant to pray and to offer up liturgies, like worship. And that's what they were doing in the temple. So the temple, and it has the Ark of the Covenant, the presence of God on earth, just like it was in the Garden of Eden. That the Temple of Solomon was like a macrocosm of the Garden of Eden. And yeah, but that's for a whole nother topic.
That's rich.
Yeah,
I definitely
it
that one.
yeah, it's gonna be I think it's gonna be an awesome paper once I'm done with it. I haven't started yet. I've just taken some notes. I got some uh things, but I've got some other projects on the back burner or in line before I do that paper. But yeah, I got a lot of projects lined up for this year. Hopefully, I can get to them. But yeah, I guess that's about all we got. I don't want to go too long. Uh, but yeah, 5 smooth stones. Hey, because Goliath had brothers. You know, it does say that Goliath did have brothers. It does say that. So maybe David was saying in case I don't, or maybe he said if I don't get him with the first rock, I got 4 other tries. But no, David got him the first shot. But yeah, but that's that number 5 again. And real quick, what I want to say about the Tanakh, I don't know if I mentioned this, but the Tanakh was called the Hebrew Scriptures, and it's an acronym for the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings. So the Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim is the acronym for that is a Tanakh, and that's the Hebrew Scriptures. And those Hebrew Scriptures are in the Old Testament of the Christians, but the Christian Bible has even more books, and they're also in different order. You know, like the orders of the Masoretic text, that the Jews put together after Christ. Probably even I think the Masoretic text came about within like the 10th century AD, that they are actually put the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible together. It came that late. And but even before that, about 20 years after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, so probably towards the end of the first century AD, when Jerusalem was destroyed and the Jews were scattered, the rabbis assembled in a town called Yavne or Jamnia, and it's famously called the Council of Jamnia, where the rabbis got together and decided what books would be put into their Bible. You know, like this was even before maybe the Gospels, maybe it was just maybe 1 or 2 have been written. I'm not too sure. I think Paul was writing his epistles at this time, but at that time, as far as the Jews were concerned, the rabbis, uh, now that they didn't have a temple anymore and they were scattered, they said, well, how are we going to preserve, the tradition? That's traditionally speaking. And so it was there in the Council of Jamnia that the rabbis got together and decided what books would be put into their scriptures that they held as inspired as the Word of God. And guys, I gotta wrap this up, but there is a whole lot more I could talk about. And it was funny. I only thought this was going to be like a 30 to 45 minute talk today, but it was like that kind of I underestimated. But there's a whole lot more to talk about, and we could go on some more about the Dead Sea Scrolls and their significance. But maybe we can do a part 2 to this. I'm not too sure how y'all feel. But really, it's kind of getting late. I gotta wrap it up. So if anybody has any quick questions, real quick, anything? Okay, guys. Well, thanks again for everybody for logging in and showing up. And like I said, this is being recorded, and God willing, I'll upload this to YouTube next week sometime. Once it's posted to YouTube, I'll send out links and DMs to everybody, and I'll post it in the Leap of Faith server, so people can, if they want to, they can go back. People that didn't some people that came in late, they didn't hear everything. You can catch it on YouTube next week, hopefully. So yeah, everybody, thanks again for joining. I appreciate your attention, and we'll see you next time.